Hi everyone, this is James Tierney from TierneyEducation.com with a quick video going over the difference between consumer surplus and producer surplus, and then showing it on a graph. Let's start with the definition of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is going to be the difference between what a consumer, and this should make sense, consumer surplus, the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for an item and what they actually pay. So let's talk a little bit more about that in depth. So we know it's consumer surplus. It's going to be the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for an item and what they actually pay. All right, well, let's think about the part of this that says the willing to pay, right? A willingness to pay. Well, a willingness to pay is really just your demand curve. And so let's draw our basic demand curve on this. We have price and quantity as our axes. Like, this is a demand curve. The demand curve really is measuring consumers' willingness to pay. So that's going to be included in our calculation, in our analysis of consumer surplus. Well, what do they actually pay? Right? What do they actually pay? Well, actually paying is just the price that they pay. That's just going to be the price that they actually pay. And where is that on here? Well, we don't really know unless we have some sort of supply curve as well. So let's go ahead and add our supply curve. And we're going to talk a little more about the supply curve when we get here for producer surplus. But for now, let's just assume that we're at equilibrium. And this is an assumption I'm going to make in this video. If you're unsure how to find the equilibrium, you can go back to a couple of other videos that I've posted or go back to your textbook. But let's assume that the price is at this equilibrium. So now if I'm looking at the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay, which we know is our demand curve, and what they actually pay is this price, this is how we know that the consumer surplus ends up being the triangle that's always going to be below the demand. So that's this part right here, below the demand curve. And it's always going to be above the price that's paid. So this is always going to be above the price that's paid. I'll darken that down here. And so it's just that vertical distance. So you can see all of this is going to be the consumer surplus. But notice it's going to stop at the quantity that ends up being produced in the market. So we're going to say it's below the demand, above the price, but then it's only up to the quantity. So only up to the quantity that's actually sold. I'm not going to put that in there, actually sold. That's how you find the consumer surplus graphically. It's very important to know the definition. It's just the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay. Willingness to pay, as we mentioned here, is just the demand curve. So it's just your demand curve. And then the price you actually pay is the price that's set, whatever it is. In this case, we're at equilibrium. I might do videos later that show a price floor or a price ceiling, or if you're above or below, but just wherever the price is. Now let's go ahead and talk about producer surplus. We'll start with the definition. Definition is going to be the difference between what a producer, right, this makes sense, producer surplus must be a producer, the difference between what a producer receives for an item and what they were willing to receive. So we can analyze this a little more as well. We have what they receive from an item. Well, receiving from an item, that's just going to be the price again. And then what they were willing to receive, well, that's what a supply curve's really showing us. It's showing us the willingness to sell an item for. Because remember, the supply curve really is our marginal cost, and we're willing to sell something at cost. We obviously want more than that, but we're willing to do it. And even going back to the demand curve is our marginal benefit. Right? That's how much I'm getting benefit for, so that's what I'd be willing to pay for it. So what does this mean? Well, if it's the difference between what you pay for an item, well, that's our price. And if I know what you're willing to receive as a supplier is going to be your supply curve, that's why we see the producer surplus being that difference between the price and the supply curve. So below the price and above supply. So I usually put that in here as well, just make this slightly smaller so we have room. It's my producer surplus is always going to be below the price, above supply curve, but again, only up to the quantity sold. So there you have it. This is a very brief introduction to finding consumer and producer surplus on a graph. We started with the definitions. It's very important to know the definitions and then be able to analyze those definitions, knowing that the willingness to pay is always represented by the demand curve. The willingness to receive is always represented by the supply curve. And then the price that you're going to pay or receive is going to be whatever price there is in the market. Now, if we're doing something like taxes, or we have some sort of subsidy or anything like that, there's a possibility that the price may be different for buyers and sellers, but we'll get to that in a later video. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below or send me an email, james@tierneyeducation.com. Until next time.